Forget the Hollywood movies. Those glamorous, clean stone castles in your mind are far from the truth. When you approached a medieval castle, the first thing to greet you was not the magnificent battlements but a foul stench. This was not just the smell of a place, it was the scent of status and a way of life. The castle was not a haven of hygiene, but a gigantic pile of stone where organic waste slowly decomposed. This odor had a bureaucratic hierarchy. The lowest tier, courtyard and moat, the rotting smell of human and animal excrement, garbage, slaughtered animal remains, and straw that hadn't been changed for weeks. This odor accumulated in the castle moats, forming a thick wall of smell in the summer. It was strong enough to instantly incapacitate anyone entering the gates. The middle tier, servants' areas, the sour smell of ale, yeast, sweat, louse-ridden woolen clothing, and unwashed cradles. Since the servants were accustomed to the smell, this was considered normal. The upper tier, the Lord's chamber, the smell persisted even here, but it was masked by flowers and herbs. Pomanders, scent carriers, or potpourri were used for guests, but this did not entirely stop the sewage odor seeping up from below. To live in the castle was to become accustomed to the smell. If you were a servant in the lower ranks, this stench was part of your identity. The wealthy used expensive spices and perfumes to reduce the odor to an acceptable level, which served as a status symbol. The sewage problem, the engineering of medieval castles, was built for defense, not hygiene. Most castles lacked a central sewage system. Waste was either dumped directly into the moats, the primary source of pollution and disease, or dropped down through simple toilet voids called guardrobes, to be detailed in Part 2, located in the outer walls, where it accumulated at the base of the ramparts. The result of this system was a constant river of waste at the base of the castle walls. The odor was not just an unpleasant experience, it was a breeding ground for disease. Water wells were often located near where the waste seeped, putting all castle residents under constant risk of diarrhea, typhoid, and dysentery. Cleaning was the responsibility of the lowest-ranking servants, groom, page, scullion. While important areas like the Lord's chamber and the chapel were attempted to be kept relatively clean, the kitchens, barracks, and courtyards were in a permanent state of filth. Floors were often covered with straw and herbs to mask the smell. However, since this straw was not regularly replaced, it eventually turned into a new source of stench and insect infestation. The bureaucracy of smell in the castle told you immediately who was who. If you smelled bad, you were worthless. And worst of all, this odor signaled not just filth, but death. At the heart of that odor was the castle's toilet, known in the Middle Ages as the guardrobe. While the name sounds elegant, it was the epicenter of a hygiene fiasco and one of the most feared bureaucratic tasks in the castle. Guardrobe architecture, a flawed solution. The guardrobe was not a modern restroom, but typically a small niche or projection built into the outer walls of the castle. Below the seating area was a vertical shaft, chute, through which waste dropped directly down the castle wall or into the moats. Architects sometimes assigned garment storage functions to these rooms, believing the ammonia fumes from the shafts would repel fleas and moths from clothes. However, this often led to permanently foul-smelling garments rather than reduced odor. The danger of royal latrines: if the castle was built on the edge of a high cliff, the guardrobe created relatively less odor. However, if the waste fell near the main courtyard or moat, the situation was catastrophic. Waste would freeze in winter and decompose in summer, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria and flies. The stench was not the only danger of this room. Guardrobe shafts were a weak point in the castle's defense. During a siege, enemies would sometimes attempt to infiltrate the castle using these toilet shafts. Thus, even a trip to the latrine carried the risk of potential enemy intrusion. The cleaning bureaucracy, groom of the stool and chamber pots, the cleaning of the latrines held a surprisingly important place in the castle hierarchy. The lord and king, one of the highest-ranking servants, would be responsible for the personal toilet service of the king or lord. In England, this person was called the groom of the stool. Their duty was to monitor the lord's toilet habits and health, clean the toilet equipment, and personally assist him. Since this position meant being closest to the king, it surprisingly held significant political power and was a position prone to bribery. Common people, when the guardrobe was insufficient in crowded barracks or guest halls, everyone used chamber pots, night buckets. These pots were kept in rooms overnight and carried out and dumped in the early morning, usually by the lowest-ranking servants, the scullions, kitchen errand boys. This task was one of the most disgusting and dangerous, as spilled waste created slippery floors and rapidly spread disease. Medieval castles were massive pollution machines that dumped their waste into the surrounding environment. The lord's ownership of the lands outside the castle did not mean he bore responsibility for cleaning up the waste. This was a class issue. The filth was seen as the problem of the poor peasants and water sources outside the castle walls. Bathing in medieval castles was not the relaxing, steamy ritual you see in films. Bathing was viewed not as a necessity, but as a luxury, or even a risk. People's approach to hygiene was based on misinformation, superstition, and, most importantly, social status. One of the widespread misconceptions in the Middle Ages was that hot water opened the pores, allowing the plague or other bad diseases to enter the body through these openings. Therefore, bathing was feared. Lords and nobles, high status, offered the opportunity for regular bathing, once or twice a week, but even this was a luxurious and ceremonial event. The bath was taken in a wooden tub with hot water brought indoors. This required significant servant labor and fuel cost. When a lord bathed, it was a status symbol, not a sign of hygiene. Servants and commoners, for those working in the courtyard and barracks, there was no such thing as regular bathing. A quick wipe with cold water, usually just the face and hands, was deemed sufficient to cleanse the body. Full body bathing was typically done only once or twice a year, before Easter or an important festival. Dressing was more important than cleaning. The basic rule of medieval hygiene was, conceal the dirt rather than clean it. Underclothes, shirts. The only hygienic line of defense was the linen undergarments worn against the skin. Linen was easier to wash than wool, though washing was difficult and infrequent. The belief was that the underclothes absorbed the dirt and sweat from the body. Therefore, changing undergarments frequently, which was an expensive luxury, was considered more important than bathing. Outer garments, heavy, woolen outer garments, were rarely washed, as wool was both difficult to dry and required expensive soap for cleaning. These clothes permanently smelled of sweat and mildew. The inevitable result of avoiding bathing was parasites. Fleas and lice. These parasites were companions to everyone, regardless of status. The straw on the castle floors, the mattresses in the beds, and the thick woolen clothes were breeding grounds for fleas. Even lords suffered, but nobles employed squires to catch the parasites. These squires were responsible for cleansing their master's body of parasites. Hair care. Hair was also not washed frequently. Lice and nits were therefore common. High-status women favored complex, tightly braided hairstyles to conceal the lice. Ironically, this provided a better hiding place for the parasites. Dental hygiene was nearly non-existent. People chewed aromatic herbs to freshen their breath or used simple powder mixtures, like rosemary and salt. Tooth decay and gum disease were rampant. With the increased consumption of sugar during feasts in the court, the oral health of the nobility rapidly deteriorated. Tooth loss was a punishment that did not discriminate based on status. Medieval hygiene was an utterly inadequate and unhealthy bureaucracy. Cleaning was not the removal of parasites from the body, but the art of masking body odor with expensive perfumes and clean linen shirts. Medieval feasts were the most magnificent way to display a lord's power and wealth. However, immediately behind this splendor, a filthy, chaotic kitchen war with no hygiene was raging. The price of the feast was exacted not only on the guests' stomachs but also on the health of the castle's lower-ranking staff. The castle kitchen typically had a floor designed to easily collect waste, but these floors were rarely cleaned properly. Slaughtered animal remains, food scraps, and dirty water made the environment permanently damp, hot, and microbe-ridden. The kitchen staff had a strict hierarchy. The master cook was high status and rarely got his hands dirty. His main job was to oversee recipes and manage the timing of the feast. Assistants, scullions, grooms, turnspits were the lowest rank. Scullions, dishwashers, were responsible for cleaning cauldrons and pots in dirty water, one of the filthiest jobs in the castle. Turnspits were usually children or slaves forced to turn massive meat spits in front of the fire for hours. These tasks carried the risk of wounds and burns from extreme heat. In the absence of modern refrigeration, keeping meat fresh was impossible. Salt and spices. The main way to mask meat spoilage was to heavily salt and spice it. The heavy use of spices at feasts was not just a display of wealth, but also an attempt to cover up decomposition. Much of the meat consumed by guests may have already started to spoil. Risk of food poisoning. Distinguishing fresh from spoiled meat was difficult. The castle's residents were constantly exposed to the risk of diarrhea, vomiting, and, at worst, fatal food poisoning. Falling ill after a feast was seen as bad luck, not the result of unhygienic practices. While feasts meant extreme abundance for the lords and their guests, the opposite was true for the kitchen and courtyard servants. Servants usually ate leftovers from the nobles' plates, which had likely sat for hours, or were fed only low-quality, stale bread and gruel. These foods were nutritionally inadequate. The lowest-ranking servants were often underfed despite their demanding physical labor. This bureaucracy of hunger behind the feasts revealed a terrible nutritional inequality even within the castle walls. Bread was the staple of the medieval diet. But dampness in kitchens and inadequate storage meant bread molded quickly. Consuming spoiled grains, especially rye, could lead to poisoning that caused hallucinations and convulsions. The castle granary was frequently invaded by rats and insects. The feast was not just a show, but a game of Russian roulette played at the expense of the health and lives of the servants. A medieval castle was not just a defensive structure made of stone and mortar, it was a bureaucratic machine employing hundreds of people, operating like a beehive. While the lord was the brain of this machine, the invisible engine that ran it was the castle's servants. Their lives were defined by a strict hierarchy and endless, demanding tasks every second of the day. The servants had a rigidly ranked structure, coming after the lord's family. The top positions were vital to the castle and held surprising power. The steward, he was the castle's CEO. He was responsible for all financial affairs, supply chain management, payrolls, and judicial proceedings. In the lord's frequent absence, he was the highest authority over the castle. The marshal, he was in charge of horses, stables, military equipment, and barracks discipline. The physical security of the castle and the logistics of the lord's travels were his responsibility. The chamberlain, he was responsible for the lord's personal services. His room, clothing, and private possessions were under the chamberlain's supervision. Positions like the groom of the stool, mentioned in Part 2, were his subordinates. These high-ranking servants formed a buffer zone between the nobles and the lower ranks, and could easily become centers of bribery, favoritism, and arbitrary authority. At the bottom of the hierarchy were those who performed the manual, dirty labor based on physical strength. Scullions, grooms, and pages formed this group. 4 a.m. start. Their day began long before dawn. Initial tasks included emptying chamber pots, lighting the fireplaces, preparing the lord's clothes, and stoking the kitchen fires. 18-hour shifts. On important days like feasts or sieges, the concept of a shift did not exist. They often worked until the lord went to bed, sometimes even having to stand guard after midnight. This was a physical and mental breakdown that lasted 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Zero privacy. Lower-ranking servants had no concept of private living space. They typically slept on kitchen floors, in barracks, or in straw near the stables. They were forced to sleep in a cold, damp, and constantly active environment. It was impossible to be apart from others. The castle's bureaucratic structure ensured the servant was observed and supervised at all times. This made any plan for rebellion or escape nearly impossible. Life in the castle was a form of paid servitude for the lower ranks. Wages were low, often paid only in food and old clothes. The stone of the castle was not just a defense against the enemy, but a wall that imprisoned the servant's freedom. At the very bottom of the medieval castle hierarchy were the servant women, living in a circle of danger even greater than that of their male counterparts. Young girls would typically enter the castle around the age of 10 and work in the kitchens, laundry, or the lord's private service. Their lives were defined by low wages, an endless workload, and the constant threat of sexual exploitation. The primary duties of servant women included carrying water, washing laundry, spinning yarn, sewing, and assisting with the personal hygiene of the lord or lady. Washing laundry, in particular, was extremely arduous due to the hygiene conditions. Women had to wash stained and foul-smelling woolen garments using strong, abrasive ashes, instead of soap, in cold water sourced from the castle moats or dirty rivers. This task damaged their hands and increased their risk of illness by constantly exposing them to the cold. The servant woman was often viewed within the castle bureaucracy as chattel or property. Male nobles, even high-ranking marshals and chamberlains, did not feel accountable to them. A female servant being subjected to sexual assault by the lord, his sons, or a high-ranking soldier was unfortunately a common and often unpunished occurrence. If a woman reported the abuse, she was rarely taken seriously, and the accusing party was often penalized by either being fired or relegated to more difficult and dangerous tasks. One of the most tragic outcomes of this exploitation was unwanted pregnancies. The fate of a pregnant servant was severe. The castle did not wish to feed a pregnant woman and subsequently a child. The woman would either be forced to secretly dispose of the child or be forced to leave the castle. A woman left outside alone with her child was thrown into poverty and even greater dangers. This situation highlights the social bureaucracy under which female labor in medieval castles operated under constant risk. Servant women constantly struggled to avoid exploitation, hide, and rely on each other to survive. A medieval castle could be protected from enemy arrows by its high walls, but it was almost impossible to defend against the most insidious and deadly enemy, disease. The crowded, unhygienic living conditions turned the castle not into a hospital, but into a breeding ground for epidemics. The diseases threatening the castle were numerous. Dysentery and typhoid were constant risks stemming from contaminated water and food. Lice and fleas carried not only itchiness but also diseases that led to greater catastrophes, like the plague. Severe cases of diarrhea and vomiting, food poisoning, especially after feasts, were commonplace among the servants and often led to death. When the plague, Black Death, reached the castle's entire rigid bureaucratic structure would collapse. Lords would initially attempt isolation. Wealthy nobles would abandon the castle and retreat to their rural manors to escape the plague. However, this meant leaving the castle's servant class to face their fate alone. The remaining servants were forced to care for the sick members of the lord's family or supervise quarantine zones. This duty was tantamount to a direct death sentence, as protective equipment, if available, it was highly inadequate, was rarely provided to them. The castle's healthcare bureaucracy was primitive. Doctors often employed harmful practices like bloodletting, phlebotomy, or tried to manage the situation with herbal remedies. Since the true causes of the illness, germs, filth, were not understood, diseases were usually attributed to God's punishment or bad air. These misconceptions led bureaucratic decisions toward disaster. Quarantine delusion. Patients were locked in small, airless rooms within the castle, which only accelerated the spread of the disease internally. Avoidance of cleaning. Because people feared bathing, due to the belief that disease would enter through the pores, the level of hygiene plummeted even further. The most difficult situation was the plight of sick servants. When a servant fell ill, they could no longer work and became a burden to the lord. They were often expelled from the castle or abandoned in isolated, unvisited rooms to their fate. This created a dilemma for the servants: hide the illness and continue working, thereby infecting others, or report the situation and be left to die. The castle's bureaucracy always tipped this decision in favor of fear. Death in a medieval castle was not a rare event but a gruesome part of daily life. Diseases, workplace accidents, war wounds, and poor nutrition caused a high mortality rate among servants and low-ranking soldiers. The castle's bureaucracy adopted a callous and practical approach to these deaths. The deceased had to be managed quickly and the bodies removed without upsetting hygiene or morale. The status of the deceased determined the treatment of the body. If a lord or a high-ranking knight died, their funeral would be a long and ostentatious ceremony, their body properly washed, dressed, and carried with honor in a coffin. However, when a servant, a scullion, or a low-ranking soldier died, the situation was completely different. Their death was not a loss for the lord, but a labor gap that needed to be filled with a replacement. A specific death chamber was designated for the bodies of servants. This room was usually located in a secluded corner of the castle, in a dark, cold, and damp area. Bodies were quickly collected there, hastily washed, if at all, and usually wrapped in a simple cloth. These holding areas for the deceased were both a hygienic disaster and posed a risk for the respread of diseases, especially during a plague epidemic. Removing the bodies from the castle was the duty of the lowest-ranking servants, often the remaining scullions or stable grooms. This work was both physically strenuous and repulsive. The bodies were transported, usually by wheelbarrow or stretcher, during the night or early morning hours to avoid detection. The final disposal was typically done in unmarked mass graves outside the castle or simply buried in the soil immediately outside the castle wall. In contrast to the care shown to nobles, a religious ceremony or a permanent grave marker for these bodies was rare. This was a painful bureaucracy indicating that a servant's death was considered as worthless as their life. The quick and unhygienic disposal of the dead was part of the castle's daily routine, because, ironically, preventing the spread of illness brought by filth and death was in the castle's best interest. The manner of managing the dead was the physical and ultimate evidence of class inequality in medieval society. Medieval castles existed for defense, and the backbone of this defense was the lord's soldiers and knights. However, behind the stories of heroism and honor, military life was governed by a filthy and unhealthy bureaucracy, sometimes worse than that of the servants. Barracks were places managed by strict discipline, but where cleanliness was completely disregarded. The soldiers' barracks life was spent in extremely overcrowded and unhygienic environments. Barracks were typically large, single-room halls where dozens of soldiers had to sleep on narrow bunks or piles of straw. At night, the room temperature would become stifling due to crowded breathing and poor ventilation. The straw bedding was rarely changed and quickly became contaminated with sweat, body dirt, and animal excrement, especially if near the stable barracks, turning it into an ideal breeding ground for fleas and lice. Soldiers often couldn't change their clothes, usually made of wool or leather, for weeks, further compounding the problem of body hygiene. The primary hygiene issue for soldiers related to the maintenance of armor and weapons. Since armor was heavy and hot, soldiers sweated profusely inside. This sweat soaked into the inner lining of the armor, turning the armor into a permanently foul-smelling, bacteria-breeding device. Armor was often not cleaned, and the moisture inside led to rusting. Rusty and dirty armor exponentially increased the risk of war wounds becoming infected. Post-battle wounds were the biggest challenge to the castle's healthcare bureaucracy. Wounds were often wrapped with dirty cloths, and since doctors struggled to understand infection, even simple injuries quickly led to gangrene and death. The castle's bureaucratic structure was inadequate to meet even the basic needs of the soldiers. Instead of using the guardrobes, soldiers often defecated just outside the barracks walls, creating a constant layer of filth around the barracks. While discipline was a priority in the military hierarchy, hygiene and health were seen as cost items and were ignored. Soldiers were in a constant battle not only against the enemy but against the filth of their own living quarters. These barracks represented the dirty, sick, and harsh reality beneath the myth of noble knighthood. Being a servant in a medieval castle was not a career choice, it was virtually a lifelong confinement. Although they were ostensibly paid employees, their lives were owned by the lord. The castle was not merely a defensive structure keeping enemies out, but a massive prison that kept the servants trapped inside. It was nearly impossible for servants, especially those in the lowest ranks, to leave the castle of their own free will. The castle's bureaucratic structure was designed to make the servant economically dependent on the castle. Wages were low and often paid in food, lodging, and old clothes. This made it impossible for the servant to save money and thus start an independent life. Leaving the castle meant not only losing employment but being completely deprived of shelter, food, and social support, which often translated to being left to die of poverty. Those who attempted to escape took a huge risk due to the castle's strong laws and military power. The castle gates were under constant scrutiny, and those caught escaping were severely punished. Punishments could include flogging, imprisonment, or, at worst, execution as punishment for challenging the system. This created a bureaucracy of fear that spread among the servants, deterring escape attempts. The servant's life was directly tied to the lord's welfare. When the lord feasted, the servant starved. When the lord fell ill, the servant was exposed to a deadly disease. However, this system was a cycle that continued for generations. When a servant woman gave birth to a child in the castle, that child was automatically integrated into the system as a new servant. The child's fate, to become a page, scullion, or harem handmaiden, was a copy of their parents' fate. This was a system of perpetual intergenerational servitude where freedom was merely a dream. The servant's final breath usually came as a result of the harsh conditions inside the castle, a work accident, an epidemic disease, or simply sheer exhaustion. As we saw in Part 8, their deaths were managed quickly and without honor. The castle would swiftly dispose of the servant's body and immediately fill the vacant position with a new pauper. Medieval castles, viewed from the outside, were monuments of power and honor. But under the stone lay a silent, filthy, and hopeless bureaucracy of servitude for the thousands of people trapped inside. This was the dirtiest and most truthful face of the chivalry tale. And so, we come to the end of this grim journey behind the stone walls of the medieval castles. We have seen that behind the glorious feasts lay starvation, beneath the armor of chivalry lay filth, and in the shadow of romantic love stories lay ruthless exploitation. The castles were not just structures keeping enemies out, they were gigantic, bureaucratic prisons that trapped the hopes, health, and freedom of thousands of people. History usually tells us only the stories of the winners and the nobles. But in this series, we saw the true cost paid by the silent victims at the very bottom of that story, the servants. What about you? Which dark corner of history would you like us to illuminate next? If you learned something from this series and want to continue seeing the truth behind history's polished facade, join our mission to expose this dark history by pressing the subscribe button on the screen right now. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when new truths are revealed. We'll see you in the next history lesson. Until then, remember to contemplate the invisible suffering beneath every magnificent structure you see.